So remember, what we're trying to do here is understand why that despite North and South America having similar levels of natural resources, they're going to develop very different societies, and North America will typically be more economically well developed, especially the United States and Canada, than South America. And we're trying to answer why that happened. Now, what we've seen so far in South America was that unfortunately, even though there's a lot of natural resources there, they were unevenly divided, in particular land, right? Land was held predominantly by the Creole elite. And because they did not want, they knew that if they were to bring in true democracy, that would probably lead to land reform. So they didn't want that, right? It would lead to land reform because the vast majority of people didn't have land. They would simply vote for land reform, which would mean that the Creoles would lose a lot of their land. They're going to oppose true democracy. And that means they won't get the power, the stability that democracy gives you. And that's going to lead to basically less economic development than what you're going to have in North America, where you'll have more democracy and more equitable distribution of land and political rights. And those two things are very closely connected in English theory, right? Remember, it's the English who are going to be predominantly settling North America, particularly Canada and the United States. We have to remember Mexico is a part of North America. So we're focusing mostly on the United States here, though a lot of what I'm going to say is also true for Canada. Okay, so first of all, one thing we want to stress is that and I have to be careful because this isn't true at all times and all places, but in English colonies, there is a tendency to give land grants to free people who are willing to immigrate, right? So if you're willing to leave England and come to the colonies, especially in the 17th and even into the early 18th century, you will be given land, right? You will be given land, right? This is because in North America, there is, in a sense, a kind of imbalance. There is a labor shortage, right? In North America, there's a labor shortage. The English have acquired a large amount of land by pushing native peoples off the land. And a lot of those native peoples, remember, have died from disease. So there is a labor shortage. So so there's, in a sense, also land surplus. So in order to colonize, in order to actually settle those areas, the English government that establishes the colonies in North America is willing a lot of times to give free people who immigrate, right? Not slaves, you have to be free, is willing to give them land. Now, a lot of people couldn't actually afford to go to the colonies, right? You are a poor English person. You do not have the money to afford a ticket to get over there and to get yourself settled, right? Even if someone gives you land, you still need money for like tools and seed and things like that. Well, one way that they're going to deal with the labor shortage in these areas is through indentured servants. So let's say that I am a wealthy person who immigrates to the colonies. I have a large farm and maybe even a plantation, you could say, and I need workers to work on it. Some people will decide that this is dealt with in some ways, of course, by bringing in African slaves. But in some areas, they decide rather to bring in what are called indentured servants. So an indentured servant would typically be an English or Irish person in the North American colonies of England who is willing to sign a contract that promises that they will work for a certain number of years for someone else, and in return they're given some money and passage to the Americas, right? So I'm a poor English person. I'd like to go to the Americas because I have that offers me kind of economic opportunity. I know I could get some land there, but I can't afford to get over there. And even if I do go over there, I still need money to get started. Well, if I become an indentured servant, someone else will pay my passage. I'll go there, and then I'll work for that person for an agreed upon number of years, and then I will be released from my service. And as a free person, I will be given land, right? I will be given land. What's fascinating, and this is, of course, I'm teaching at Lander University, which is in South Carolina, so I'm very interested in the history of the Carolinas and how it connects to world history. And what people may not know is that John Locke, our friend John Locke, who we've talked about before, wrote the original Constitution for the Carolinas. And remember, John Locke closely connected property owning with political rights. So what happened was all free people are given land when they come to the Carolinas. And if you come to the Carolinas as an indentured servant, don't worry. Once you're done with your indentured servitude, once you've worked your set number of years, you are then given land. And one thing I want to point out, women were also given land. They weren't given the right to vote, but women were also given land if they went, right? So this was men and women. That's how interested they were in getting people to come over and settle, that even women got land. And they wanted to make sure that there were plenty of women as well, because then they could marry men and they could have kids, so who would then settle the land. So John Locke has in his document, kind of like a constitution for the Carolinas, states that all free people are given land when they come to the Carolinas. This will include indentured servants once they have finished their period of servitude. And the key thing is, once you get land, you have a certain amount of land, you get voting rights. Now, the theory was that only people who were believed to be responsible enough to take part in the political process should, and land ownership was considered a sign of responsibility. The idea is that by owning land, you have a stake, you have a personal interest in making sure that the government prospers, and that the country prospers, and therefore you should have a say, right? So land ownership was understood as giving you a kind of sense of responsibility, a kind of investment in the system. So what happens then, because all free people are given land when they come to the Carolinas, and if you were a man and you owned a certain amount of land, you got voting rights, lots of people are going to be able to vote. And typically the amount of land you were given was enough to give you the right to vote. So what that means is that the way that the English settle their colonies leads to widespread property ownership. And because political power is connected to property ownership, lots of people can vote. So it's very different from what we see in Latin America. Remember, in Latin America, South America, pretty much the Creole elite, a very small group of people, dominated politics and dominated the economy. But here, you're going to have a lot more widespread. Relatively more people will own land. That means wealth will be more distributed evenly. And because voting, political power is connected to land ownership, because land ownership, economic power is divided fairly evenly, or at least widespread, that means a lot of people will also have political power, right? That means a lot of people will have political power. Numbers of people are left out of this. As I mentioned before, women are left out of this. People of African descent, right? Some of them are free, but they're going to be excluded from this. And of course, those who are slaves are not property holders. They are property in the American system. The native peoples, the original inhabitants of the land, are excluded from this. So I don't want us to see this as just a 100% good thing, right? I mean, it's not. There's some significant major problems here. But the key thing I want to emphasize is that there was enough equity in this system that this brought stability that allowed North America to develop economically ahead of South America. But like I said, there is a problem. There is an injustice in this system because it excludes a lot of people. However, it is less exclusive than what you had in South America, more equitable. And it ends up being equal enough to bring significant stability. So to kind of summarize, the relatively equal distribution of land, wealth, and political power, that is democracy, allows North America, particularly the United States, and also, of course, Canada, to enjoy the stability needed for economic growth. And you can kind of see this. I like to point this out. The number of successful coups, rebellions against the U.S. government in American history is 0. Right? If you study the history of other countries, there are a lot of coups, a lot of rebellions. Right? But once you have an established democracy, the number of coups and rebellions that are successful goes way down. Like I said, in the United States, it's 0 if we understand these as successful coups and rebellions. This is because people are typically convinced that it's better to work within the system rather than to try and overthrow it. Right? It's much better for me to try and work within the democratic system, to support political parties or political candidates I like, to try and win votes rather than trying to overthrow the entire system. Now, you may say, well, Dr. Rausch, wait a second. wasn't there this thing that lasted between 1861 and 1865, killed about 600,000 people? I think it was something called the American Civil War. Isn't that an exception? And I'll say, yes, that was an exception. That is a time when democracy failed to bring stability because the issues at hand fundamentally could not be resolved through compromise, right? As Lincoln said, we can't continue to exist half slave, half free, right? Something has to be done. So it's not that democracy always works. I mean, you can't just have kind of half slavery. It just has to be completely gotten rid of. And bluntly speaking, I can't compromise on that. It's just get rid of slavery. It's bad. And that's you have issues like that democracy has a hard time dealing with. But I want to stress, first of all, I'm talking in relative terms. I'm talking about relative stability, not absolute stability. And also I did say successful rebellions, right? This is an example of an unsuccessful rebellion. So the key thing I want to stress here again is that I'm emphasizing that in North America, you're going to have democracy bring greater stability. That doesn't mean absolute stability. Also, I need to stress here that even during the American Civil War, we still had presidential elections. Abraham Lincoln did not say, we're having this really terrible war. I think I need to declare a state of emergency and suspend the Constitution and not have elections. No, they had elections during the war. And it was a real, election. It wasn't like a fake one. They actually had like a true election. So this is how deep these democratic roots go in the United States. Even during this kind of existential struggle, there still is this faith in democracy to try and work things out. And in the end, it is successful. So the key thing here then, we're now shifting a little bit to talk about how the United States becomes particularly powerful, right? We have a lot of resources, right? And because of the commitment to property owning democracy, these are going to be, I would say, relatively and sufficiently spread out and shared so that there will be relative stability, sufficient stability. Like I said, there's lots of people who unfortunately and unjustly are excluded from this, but my key point is that there's enough that we have stability. Then when there is a civil war, the centralizing forces, the federal government will win, the Union will win, and so the United States will stay one country. And this then, all this together, this property owner democracy, the rise of a central government that's able to hold this country together, the ending of slavery, that will all set the stage for the rise of the United States, right? So we've been talking so far in a sense about how, the European countries, the Western countries become so powerful because they have those four revolutions. Remember, the economic, political, scientific, and industrial. We're now going to talk about how those, in a sense, impact the United States and how the United States will contribute to them and how the United States will become a world power, right? That's what we're going to be kind of focusing on now. So we already talked a little bit about the political and economic revolutions in the United States. So, but to kind of continue with that, we want to know, just to give you an idea of how the United States is changing. In the year 1800, our country had a population of 5 million. 6 out of 7 were farmers. So we were primarily an agricultural country. We had no cities over 100,000 people. So think about that. In the year 1800, there was no city bigger than Greenville, right? There was no city in the United States bigger than Greenville. But a mere 60 years later, our population had gone up by a factor of 6. We're now larger than Britain. There were now 9 U.S. cities over 100,000 people, and only half of our population were farmers. So the United States is transitioning. We're becoming bigger, and we're moving from an agricultural to an industrial economy. We are experiencing the Industrial Revolution. In 1865, after the Civil War, we had 35,000 miles of railroad track. That's 3 times the amount of Great Britain. And like Great Britain, the Industrial Revolution is developing on its own, right? The government doesn't have to help necessarily a whole lot. But what I want to stress here, right, we're becoming industrialized. And what this means is we can now catch up and eventually surpass the power of European countries because we are a bigger country, we have access to more resources, and we have more people. right? It's not that we're necessarily superior to European countries. That's not the argument I'm trying to make. What I'm trying to say is we have this one big government that controls more land, more territory, more people, more resources than European countries. So as we experience an industrial revolution, it makes sense that that's going to lead us to become more powerful than the European countries, particularly Great Britain. And as an industrializing country, we're going to take part and actually contribute a lot to what's called the Second Industrial Revolution, right? The Second Industrial Revolution, which is understood as beginning in 1870. So the first industrial revolution I've been talking about previously in section 4, where we talked about things like iron and railroads and things like that. What marks the second industrial revolution is different is it has new, more complex technologies, right? New, more complex technologies. And also, whereas the first industrial revolution is in a sense an era of iron, this is an era of steel, right? Steel is lighter, harder, and more durable than iron. It's just better. And you can kind of think about it this way. You can't really make a car out of iron, be too heavy, and it just wouldn't work very well. You can, though, make a car out of steel. And cars, again, are an example of these new, more complex technologies that I'm talking about. And to give you further examples of new, more complex technologies, we have a chemical revolution that's a part of the second industrial revolution. There will be development of chemical fertilizers, dynamite, right, which is extraordinarily powerful and necessary if you want to do things like build a tunnel through a mountain or build its powerful bombs. And of course, plastics. I mean, everything is made of plastic, right? These are more complex technologies that you cannot develop without understanding why things work. That's the relationship, right? I want to stress that the scientific revolution is necessary because it leads people to ask why things work. That leads them to better understand how things work, and they can apply that to technology, right? Such as fertilizer, dynamite, plastic. And one of the things that I think that's really amazing that comes out of the second industrial revolution is electricity. I mean, electricity is almost like magic, right? I mean, because you can't really see it function. Like you can watch like a clock or a steam engine function and you understand its movements. But electricity is almost like magic. And it's astounding that human beings can not only understand it, but harness it for our use. And this is very, very, this kind of complex technology and science leads to things that really directly impact people's lives. For example, Thomas Edison develops long-lasting light bulbs, right? When you think about it, in many ways, a light bulb is very simple, but the principles underlying it are very complex. But it utterly transforms people's lives because now you can do stuff at night, right? In the past, you could have whale lights or, whale lanterns and things like that. By that, I mean lanterns that use whale oil and so forth. But light bulbs are much cheaper, much more efficient, and much brighter. And so now you can really have a city that doesn't sleep. And even relatively poor people can have a light bulb that will allow them to work into the night, to read books or be together as a family or whatever. So the second industrial revolution, the other thing that's very important is not only is it developing new, more complex technologies, it's developing technologies that are going to impact more and more people, right? The first industrial revolution did touch people's lives, right? You could now get on a train or a steamship and immigrate much easier. The second industrial revolution will touch people's lives to an even greater degree. And we have to take a step back, I think, and understand how science, industry, and economics all kind of work together. So one thing that happens as part of the second industrial revolution, and particularly in the United States, is that the economy and the law are set up in such a way to limit risks while rewarding people who are willing to take risks and rewarding people who are willing to innovate, right? So for example, investing in a business can be kind of dangerous. Let's say that I want to start a business and I need to borrow money, so I put my house up as collateral. My business fails, I can't pay back the loan, I lose my house. That's one reason why people will establish corporations, right? A corporation is essentially legally is a person, and when you put money into a corporation, you can only lose the amount of money you put into it. It allows people to raise money in a sense while protecting their personal assets. And we've already talked about corporations in this class. But this allows for people to take a risk. I don't want to take an economic risk. I don't want to invest in new technology if it might cause me to lose my house. But I am willing to risk an investment if I know how much I can lose, right? If I say, well, I've got $500 extra, I'm going to invest it in this corporation. If it makes money, that's great. My risk will be rewarded. And of course, my taking this risk will hopefully encourage innovation because, hey, if they're able to do something good with my money, that's going to help us all by leading to a new invention. But if it fails, all I lose is my $500 and I knew that I could afford to lose it anyway. Similarly, there'll be the development of bankruptcy laws that will allow people, in a sense, to try again, right? There will be laws that will protect my assets so that if I do try and launch a business and it fails, I can at least protect some of my property, right? So it's important. One thing you'll notice is there's a lot of famous wealthy people, Donald Trump is an example, who have declared bankruptcy multiple times and still managed to become extraordinarily wealthy because bankruptcy allows you to take a risk, you fail, you declare bankruptcy, you try again, right? It allows you to kind of rebuild. So it limits risks while also encouraging you to take risks because the risks are limited, and that leads to innovation, right? Another example is that there will be further developments, we talked about this earlier, with patents, right? A patent is a protection for intellectual property, right? A patent allows you to be able to make money from something you invent. People can't just steal your ideas. They can't just reverse engineer the something you invent and figure out how you did it and then just start making it themselves. No, if they use your innovation, they have to pay you. And that's great because that rewards you for taking risks and for innovating, right? An example of someone who is engaged in this kind of thing is Charles Goodyear, right? This guy will actually, he lives in a time when he'll be thrown in jail for his debts, which doesn't make sense. How can you pay your debts when you're in jail? The idea is that your family will hopefully take care of it. But Charles Goodyear is an example of this. He's the guy that figures out something called vulcanization. People knew about rubber, and they thought rubber was really cool, and it's this very interesting material because it's, you can shape it, you can move it around. But the problem with rubber is that it melted under high pressure and high heat. And, you would maybe like to use rubber to make a seal for a gasket or for a piston in an internal combustion engine or something like that. But you couldn't because it was too hot. And imagine if you had rubber tires on your car, but if you went 30 miles per hour in your car, the rubber would get hot and would melt. Those wouldn't make very good tires. Charles Goodyear figured out this process called vulcanization, which allowed him to make rubber that was able to stand up to heat and to pressure, right? So that it wouldn't melt under pressure. And what's important to understand about this vulcanization is kind of two things. It was made possible because he was, in a sense, able to patent it and then make money off of it, right? He invested huge amounts of his own money, took a lot of risks, like even physical risks, because he almost died, he almost poisoned himself trying to make it. He took a lot of risks to make this. And if someone could have just stolen it from him, well, if I'm looking at that and I'm like, oh, this Goodyear, he took all these risks to make something new that helps people, but someone stole his idea and is making money off of it without having to invest their time and money. I don't want to be like Charles Goodyear. I'm not going to innovate because someone else will just steal it. Better that I steal someone else's ideas rather than take the risk myself. However, again, because Goodyear's process of vulcanization was protected by intellectual property rights, he was able to make money off of it. And that inspired other people to be willing to take risks and innovate because they knew that if they did so, they would profit. And what's key is inventions will build on one another, right? Once Charles Goodyear innovates and figures out this new invention, right? Once he innovates and figures out this new invention, other people can use it, right? Other people can now use this better rubber that can stand up to heat and pressure that he has developed. And of course, one of the inventions that shows this complexity, that shows, of course, in particular, the importance of rubber, is the automobile. Right? In the year 1900, there were about 9,000 cars in the entire world. Right? 9,000 cars in the entire world. And cars were essentially a toy for rich people. But by 1916, Henry Ford, through developing the assembly line, was making 735,000 cars a year. And what's fascinating about this, right? That we call this mass production. He's making a huge amount of cars, And he makes them cheaply enough that people can afford them, right? More people can afford them. You don't have to be rich. His own workers could afford to buy the cars that they themselves built, right? We call this mass production, and it was made possible by specialization. Someone would engage in the same kind of work on an assembly line. You would spend all day assembling tires, and someone would take that tire and put it on the car, right? You had one task that you did repeatedly, and through standardization, you had all the standardized parts, right? So that you would, each wheel was the exact same, so you could use, it was easy to fix the machine, it was easy to build these parts, and then simply assemble them into a finished car. And because of the efficiency of mass production brought about by specialization and standardization, you have cheaper cars. So you can mass produce these cars. Lots of people then can afford them because they're comparatively cheap, right? So we can see how the second industrial revolution is bringing about, these important new inventions that are very complex, right? Bring together lots of different moving parts, lots of different advances, but they're priced low enough that they can impact the lives of increasing numbers of people. Now, thus far, I've been focusing on the American contributions, and I've done that because I want to highlight how the United States, as a rising industrial and scientific power, is making massive contributions, in a sense, to the world. And we need to understand this is, partly connected to the United States becoming a world power. However, it's not just Americans, right? The radio was invented by an Italian named Marconi in the year 1901. And again, this shows us this kind of transformation that is coming about in people's lives through the second industrial revolution. Of course, you can't develop a radio without understanding science. And what's also key is that the development of ideas of mass production will eventually allow these scientific marvels to be mass produced so that most families can afford a radio. And what happens is when you have all these people having radios, you can start having a mass media. You can have radio shows, broadcasts of baseball games or soccer games on the radio. You will have a true mass media, right? You will have orchestras, shows, all these different things will appear on the radio. So you have a mass media, and that allows for united popular culture. So, for example, this will allow for the development of baseball teams that will have a complete following across the whole United States. You may cheer for the New York Yankees even though you're not from New York and have never been to New York, because you can listen to it on the radio and you care about what's going on there, right? And you can take an American from any part of the country and take them to another part of the country, and they will have listened to the same radio shows and can talk about them. They will know the same actors on the radio. And of course, once you have the development of movies and TV and so forth, this just becomes even stronger. So we're starting through mass production and the rise of a mass media to develop a united popular culture that will bind people more closely together, right? But again, key to what we see here is these revolutions that we've talked about, the political, economic, scientific, and industrial, are all uniting in ways that are impacting huge numbers of people's lives directly. And this will lead quite literally to what will save lives. And I think a great example of this, of how all these revolutions work together to really impact people's lives by making life possible, would be the advances of the French scientist Louis Pasteur. Now, Louis Pasteur started off as just a pure scientist. He was just trying to answer a question, why? In particular, he was trying to develop a scientific understanding of fermentation, the process by which certain chemicals or materials will become alcohol, right? Fermentation is understanding how things ferment into alcohol. How do grapes, or I should say rather, why do grapes ferment and make wine, or grain ferment and make beer? So he was asking a science question. He was asking why. And based on his answer was because of special microbes, because of special bacteria. And that led him to develop the germ theory of disease. Why do things ferment? Well, because of these microbes. Well, why do people get sick? Well, because of these microbes. And based on this science, this way of answering why things work, we're going to have the development of new technologies that directly impact people's lives. For example, pasteurization. Heating milk to a certain temperature kills the microbes that might be there and prevents us from getting sick. Abraham Lincoln's mother, for example, died because she drank milk during a period when there was no pasteurization. It had microbes in it. It gave her a disease that killed her. Right? So this literally saves lives. Understanding why we have germs, why germs cause disease, leads to technologies that save people's lives. Similarly, Louis Pasteur will develop vaccines to treat particular diseases, right? Because now we understand what causes disease. There will also, because we understand what causes a lot of things like cholera, because we understand now, thanks to Louis Pasteur and others like John Snow, we understand that these are caused by germs, and it's caused by contamination of water. So if we have modern plumbing and sanitation, we can keep water clean, and then people won't get sick and will not die, right? So you can see here the why, asking this basic question, why do things happen? Science helps lead to the application technology of new forms of technology, pasteurization, vaccines, and modern plumbing and sanitation. And the second industrial revolution gives us the economic power to take action and mass produce vaccines and to build modern plumbing and sanitation. So again, all these revolutions are working together. They're saving untold lives. So this is really a revolutionary time period between 1870 and 1940, right? Someone who lived in 1870, right, who was lived before 1870, they have a good chance of dying of disease. They will have difficulty walking. They have difficulty traveling anywhere beyond where they could walk, unless they can afford a train ticket or a ticket on a steamship. They certainly aren't going to own their own train or their own steamship. They will be limited in their entertainment by just whatever they can go see. Maybe they can, listen to someone play music, or they can sing or something like that. They can play cards. But by 1940, right, human beings will have a very good chance of being vaccinated against diseases. They'll have very low chances of catching serious diseases in comparison to before. Many human beings will be able to afford a car, right? They may have their own radio that will allow them to enjoy entertainment from across the country. So there's a huge amount of changes that are taking place, right? In the 1860s, right, you'd be reading by candlelight. By 1940, you've got electricity. So the period between 1870 and 1940 led to improvements in human lives in many respects at a greater rate than what had ever been experienced before in human history. And we want to stress this is global, especially concentrated in Western Europe and North America, right? The United States is going to play an important role in these developments.